Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a program for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes, or to suggest a particular topic or guest you would like to hear featured on the program. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, we're going to unpack again a popular topic, short-term missions. Together with Gena Thomas, who has been both a short-term worker and a long-term worker, we're going to look at some of the potential pitfalls of short-term missions if we don't plan to do it well. We're looking forward to this interview, which includes some constructive criticism for those of us who share in short-term missions. Just before we get to the interview, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
Do you know a missionary kid returning to Canada this summer? Reboot is a week-long retreat for MKs that helps them to process their transition and connect with other MKs experiencing the same changes. Visit www.canadianmk.net to learn more about Reboot camps happening this July and August in Calgary, Alberta, and Kitchener, Ontario. And now, here's today's interview.
Hi again, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Our guest today is Gena Thomas, who is an author, having served as a mission worker in Mexico together with her husband, Andrew. There, they ran a coffee shop ministry, and they taught English, and they ventured into another ministry, which I'll let Gena introduce during the interview, all while partnering with the local church. She has completed her graduate work in international development through Eastern University, and she is passionate about the church being a catalyst for holistic poverty alleviation. Gena, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Our topic today is short-term missions, and we're going to explore the idea of charity versus justice. This is something that Gena has written on. We'll get to that in just a minute. Gena, I wonder if you would take just a moment, please, and introduce yourself to our audience so that we have some sense of who you are and how you came to be passionate about what you're doing.
Sure. When I was 16 years old, I went on my first short-term missions trip. And since then, up until I was married, I traveled a lot, sometimes on missions trips, sometimes to visit family or friends, and sometimes just to travel. After college, I moved to Honduras and lived there for about a year and a half, teaching at a bilingual school there. And then in December 2008, my husband and I were married. And then by August 2009, we had moved to Mexico to serve as long-term missionaries there. We were there almost 4.5 years, and while there, we taught English, we served as youth pastors, and we started a coffee shop ministry under the covering of our local pastor to reach the international rock climbers in the area. There is a community there of rock climbers to a place called Potrero Chico, and people from all over the world come to climb, and so we really wanted to reach that particular community and also bridge that community to the local Mexican community, which there didn't seem to be much of a bridge there. So that was our intent.
Now, you have recently published a book called A Smoldering Wick. And I have a quote here from the introduction. You say this: your desire, or my desire for this book, is to see short-term missions go from being a smoldering wick to becoming a strong fire that brings light and heat to a dark and cold world. So, would you begin, please, by expanding a bit on what you mean by describing short-term missions as a smoldering wick?
Absolutely. This is an awesome question to be able to answer as an author because there's so much thought that goes into the title. The word smolder means to burn slowly with smoke but no flame. So the phrase actually comes from Isaiah 42, 1-4. And Isaiah is talking about Jesus, who is going to bring justice to the nations. It says, "He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice." So as a long-term missionary, I saw the attitudes of my neighbors when short-term teams would come and leave. And I saw the damage done firsthand and saw how inconvenienced life could be when teams came. And told, especially when they came in an attitude of this is what we're going to do, whether you want it or whether it serves you or not. So for a good while, I really thought that the best course of action for the North American church was to just completely snuff out short-term missions altogether. But then I saw some teams come down with a posture of humility who actually really wanted to work alongside of the church rather than tell the church what to do. And those really modeled for me that short-term missions can be done well, and they can offer much to both those receiving and sending communities if they are done so.
Mm-hmm. Well, listeners to this podcast will know that we are trying to engage with this great dynamic or this movement of short-term missions, and how do we do it well? How do we do it in a healthy way? So we're not just busy. This sounds like we're spot on for this conversation then. You talk about doing short-term missions from a charity standpoint. Take a minute and unpack that a bit for us, please. What do you mean by a charity standpoint?
Sure. The word charity, and this came from some research that I had done for graduate studies. I was really trying to understand that word. And as I was hosting focus groups on the concept of charity, I really wanted to understand more about what the Bible was saying about that word, and found out that charity as we know it today, as we define it today, is not actually found in the Bible. And so I go into detail on this in the book, but essentially the idea that that charity is a handout. And basically this concept means that the haves hand something out to the have-nots. And automatically there's a power play involved in that transaction, whether we want there to be or not. And basically those who are giving the tangible item are up on a pedestal telling those below them, we have what you don't. We have what you need to make your life look more like ours.
Wow.
But it's not only with tangible items. This is something that happens with preaching. It's something that happens with attitudes. A lot of times North American pastors would come down, preach to the locals, and assume that because their knowledge is more advanced than the knowledge of the locals, they had something to say, and they were the ones who should be saying it. And that was something that I saw firsthand and just really bothered me. So altogether, the message that's being sent to the community is the local church is not enough. They need the North American brothers or sisters in order to offer what the community needs to that community. Right. So this is the concept of charity, and it harms both those who are receiving and those who are giving, because the receiver is reinforced with the idea that their self-worth is low and always will be, because they will never have what they need without outside help.
I see.
And then it harms the giver because it reinforces the idea that their pride is justified and they're better than those who they're giving to, whether they're conscious of that or not.
Well, it's important that we understand what you mean when you're using the word charity in this way. And
Absolutely.
I just kind of get this idea of a superiority tone that
yes.
I suppose sometimes that is unintentional. Would you say it's unintentional at times?
Absolutely. And I think part of the unintentionality of it is our concept of short-term missions as they are planned to be. We're typically going on short-term missions to do something for or give something to, rather than kind of coming into the vision and mission of the receiving community. And so I think just the framework itself needs to kind of shift before we can even start with our personal attitudes.
Mm-hmm. You've outlined just a few of the pitfalls, negative consequences of just doing charity, superiority-based ministry. But if this is true, why do you think we continue to do it this way? Why isn't it changing?
Well, there are several reasons I think that it's not changing, one of which I think we have changed some of the terms, but haven't actually changed the behaviors behind those terms. Okay. One of the things that I talk about in the book, one of the things that I have mapped out there is a concept of, it's a typology of participation, which basically goes through different types of participation that we typically just in human behavior that we are a part of, whether it's manipulative or actually participating from a standpoint of this is who I am, this is what I want to do from myself. And so what I've done with that's actually there was a professor in London that created that. And what I did was I created another side to that table and filled in, these are types of mission trips that go along with this participation. So what we think is, healthy participation of the locals is actually partially manipulative participation, whether we can see it or not. Initially, we have to really dig deep and try to understand better what we're doing and what we're asking them to do. I think it takes serious intentionality to change behavior. And so when we read books like When Helping Hurts, we say, yeah, that makes sense, but I don't see a clear path on how to get there. And then there's time issues, time crunches. I've got 2 weeks before this missions trip and I've got to plan something real quick. And I really want to incorporate what that book says, but I don't know how to do it in this time. And so I think that's why a lot of what we want to change doesn't actually change, because we're not intentional about making it change.
Okay. I've got a couple ideas I want to ask you about here.
Sure.
One is bringing out a practical example of what you said. It's difficult just in the podcast to see the chart, so to speak.
Sure.
But one of the things I did hear you say is how important preparation is.
Mm-hmm.
That there's good intention. We'd like to do it well, but oh man, it's just in 2 weeks and we got to get something going here.
Yes.
That speaks to our intentionality early before a trip takes place and how important that preparation phase is.
It really is. And in fact, within my book, I've got a couple of different appendices that are set up specifically to help those who are planning short-term missions to really think through this process and try to plan it in a way that's not just beneficial to those who they're accountable to, quote unquote, but also beneficial to those who are going down and being served, quote unquote. So
super. Just to help us understand a little better, can you give us an example of a characteristic of participation?
Sure. So one of the participation typologies is manipulative participation. And this basically, the concept is that participation is a pretense with people's representatives on official boards that are unelected, basically telling them what to do. So an idea with a short-term missions trip is, this is a North Carolina church telling a church in Mexico that it plans to send a team to paint houses over the summer. The North Carolina church asked the Mexican church to come up with a list of 10 people's houses they can paint. The North Carolina church never asks if there are other needs within the church's community or if painting these houses will address any need at all. They simply ask for the list of 10 houses and plan the trip accordingly. The pretense is that the Mexican church is participating, quote unquote, by choosing those 10 houses.
So they're not really in on the ground floor of thinking through what would be the most valuable contribution to that particular community.
Absolutely.
Uh-huh. Well, we get an idea, I think, of what you mean by the charity standpoint. And charity, again, in this case, is not a positive sense. It's actually a negative sense, that there's a duality, a superiority complex. But let's turn to the other side. Instead of doing charity, you talk about doing short-term missions from another point of view. Let's go to that.
Sure. So this point of view is justice, from a justice standpoint, and I just get so excited about talking about this. I love the concept of justice and never really understood it. I think it's easy for us as North Americans to think we know what justice is because we define it the way that our culture does. But when we start looking at the Bible and how it defines it, it's a completely different concept. So in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, there are two words in particular that are translated as the word justice. And those two words, one of them is mishpat, which means giving someone what is due to him. And the other is tzedakah, which is a life of right relationship. So we have these two concepts, and typically when you put them together, we get our concept of social justice from the Old Testament. Those two are intertwined a lot within the Old Testament. And when you think about mishpat, it's really impossible to give someone what's due them if you have no relationship with them. So the two are very connected. And from a justice standpoint, short-term missions, STMs, they start and end with a relationship and only with a relationship. And if we can't start there, then we can't really do what we're trying to do, which I believe in general, all of us would say that the Great Commission is even why we do short-term missions to begin with. And we can't fulfill the Great Commission without relationship. So when we don't consider cultivating relationships and what effect our trips will have on relationships within the sending and receiving communities, then we're really looking at the wrong place. If all we're looking at is trying to see how many houses we're going to paint or how many youth are going to get changed because they go on this trip, we're not looking at the bigger picture of it all.
Mm-hmm. And even though those ideas are well-intentioned, it's a different type of conversation, a deeper conversation, really.
It is
based on relationship and familiarity.
It is, and I think one of the toughest things about good intentions is that while it might simply look like good intentions from one side, on the other side, when you're living long term in a place and you see a team come down and they have good intentions of what they're doing, they might be able to go back and not worry about the repercussions of the harm that their good intentions did. But those who stay there have to deal with that harm.
Sure.
So it's a very dangerous thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's another angle. I'll come back to that. The idea of the long-term worker there too. But I want to suppose that most of our listeners would like to do short-term missions if they're involved in that in a healthy way. We're going to assume the best, and those good intentions are there. Let's get to some guidelines that you have to offer as advice for a church that wants to do it well. They want to do short-term missions well. What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, the first and foremost, I think, as a short-term missions leader, there needs to be defined boundary lines around what he, she, and really the church as a whole wants a short-term missions trip to be. Because if there are no boundary lines, then the short-term missions will end up, it could be so many different things. It could be a potential salvation trip for a teenager whose mother really wants him saved, or it could be a trip where a professional welder with a horrible attitude completely ruins a relationship between two very tight-knit communities. It could be where just a bunch of youth kids who don't know how to paint make a huge mess of some local homes. So there's the potential to be almost anything as a short-term missions trip if those boundary lines aren't drawn. So I think one of the first things that I have in the book is talking about having an application process for those who are coming on the short-term missions, because whether we're talking about attitude or aptitude, both of those things are very important in choosing who's going to come on the short-term missions trip. And I think beyond that, you have to, again, when we talk about right relationship, if the short-term mission trip leader is in right relationship with everyone who's coming on the trip, then they won't really need the application. But in today's world, with bigger and bigger churches, I think it's very important that we have something of that, and that those who are going understand the goal and what the idea of this mission trip is, so that everyone's on the same page when they do go. Sure. Another guideline I think is another thing that I have is a partnership relationship in which a sending and receiving communities or churches, whichever you want, are trying to determine if the current relationship that they have with each other is mutually beneficial. Because I think sometimes those are not actually beneficial. And like maybe there's a church here in North Carolina that loves to do vacation Bible school, but they always want to come, during their summertime here. But if you go to Nicaragua, the school year is different. So their summertime here, people are in school in Nicaragua. And so sometimes what happens in those situations is that this church in North Carolina maybe needs to partner with someone who really, a receiving community who wants that and who appreciates that. And maybe this church in Nicaragua is not that church.
Mm-hmm. And that would be a really important thing to know early in the planning process.
Yes, it would.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, you know what? Here's where I want to, maybe I'll tuck in my question here. How does this fit together with long-term workers? You mentioned the fact you were long-term workers, you and Andrew together, and you saw this dynamic unfolding. You observed it to varying degrees, probably. What was the integration with you as a long-term worker on site there?
Yeah, so kind of what I'm talking about with the school thing, there was a couple of times where certain groups would come down when it was summertime, like in early June. Well, in Mexico, the school year doesn't get out until very late June, towards the end of June. And so I was still teaching at the time. And so there were times when they needed me to translate or they needed me to do something, and I would have to be taken away from my classroom in order to do that. And so I think it's really important that we understand, if we're not as short-term missions trips, building the long-term vision of the people who are already there and on the ground, then we're actually doing some potential damage, because those are the people, and they have the connections with the locals in a way that short-term missions doesn't. And so we need to be very aware of how they're doing and what they're feeling. And they typically become the middlemen between the short-term missions trip and the local church. And so it's really important to just not let them be only a translator, but also ask questions and try to follow up through, do you think this is a good idea? Do you think this local pastor is telling me the truth when he says it's okay that we come? All those kinds of things that as short-term missions trippers, if you want to call us, we can't understand that fully because we don't know the context very well.
Boy, what an important asset to access and to bring into this whole element. The idea of short-term mission, that there are long-term workers, if they are in proximity, they can be of help.
Absolutely.
Like you said, beyond translation work.
Right. And a lot of times they are the ones who know the vision and the mission of the local pastor. And they're able to tell us, frankly, this is not part of that mission. I'm sorry. Let's plan a different trip, or maybe you should go somewhere else, so.
Very good. I wonder if there are particular resources or tools that you would recommend to a church that wants to do a good job of this.
Yeah, in my book, there are basically the book is divided up into 3 sections: theology, theory, and practice. And the last 3 chapters are very technical, specifically for this purpose, because what I wanted to offer people was not just, hey, this is how we're doing short-term missions and it's not doing very good. I wanted to make sure that there was practical tools and advice on how to do things differently and how to do things better. And really, a lot of this stems from my studies in international missions or international development. And I felt like so much of that overlapped with missionary work. And so I wanted to create a bridge between those 2 concepts. So there's things within the book that I discuss, like project cycles or asset mapping, focus groups, stakeholder charts, those kinds of things, problem trees. And I think those are all very important concepts, tools that we could use as short-term mission trip leaders in making those a lot more effective on the ground.
So some great things in the appendices there that may be very practical, of very practical use. Gena, in your book, you talk about bringing integrity to marketing or spreading the word, inviting people to be involved in short-term missions. You have 5 points there. What are those 5 points, first of all, just in a short list, and then we'll unpack those a little bit.
Yeah. So the 5 points are, the first one is to not dehumanize the viewer. The second one, focus on the whole picture, the negative and the positive. Thirdly, not focus on quick fixes. Fourth, not oversimplify the problem or our ideal response to the problem. And finally, number 5, point to Christ.
You craft a term, integritize, to bring integrity to our marketing strategies. Please just talk a little bit about that. What do you mean by integritize?
In thinking about marketing and thinking about trying to bring people into your short-term missions trips, whether you're a short-term mission leader or you're a church in general, I think it's important, and these concepts to me personally are important, not just in short-term missions, but in general. But again, if we look at a life of right relationship and we look at giving people what is due to them, what is due to people, well, dignity is certainly due to them. If everyone is created in God's image, then we certainly need to make sure that we're giving people dignity in this process. And that's nothing short in marketing as well. It's easy to manipulate people in marketing. And one of the things I think that's a huge, easy, maybe some quicksand in marketing is to have a picture of, a suffering child or a kid with flies all around him, or something to the effect of saying, "Hey, you need to come on this mission trip because if you don't, who's gonna save, quote unquote, this person?"
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually very demeaning in so many ways. And what we're doing is we're perpetuating a what's called a God complex or a savior complex that says, if you don't do this, this kid's going to die. So the couple of different things that I ask people to do is, one, to not dehumanize the viewer,
Mm-hmm.
and not dehumanize the person in the pictures. So when we're talking about, if you are going to a poverty-stricken area specifically for short-term missions, to show not just those sad and horrible pictures that kind of create an emotion in us that says, "Oh gosh, I have to do this." And then again, kind of in that same concept, to focus on the whole picture. And it's pretty easy for us to either focus fully on the negative or fully on the positive. As a long-term missionary, the temptation was to constantly send out newsletters that say, "Look at all the positive things that we're doing," and kind of make sure that people are continue to support us because of all those positives. And the reality is, life is the same everywhere we go. There are negative and there are positive. And if we lean too much on the negative, on despair, then we don't introduce the hope of the world. And if
Sure.
we focus too much on everything that's good, then we fail to introduce the savior of the world. So it's important that as we look at our marketing strategies, we point to Christ in everything that we do. It's important that we don't focus on quick fixes, because a lot of poverty solutions are not going to be quick fixes, and we have to recognize that and have to understand that, as the American or the North American church, we're not in the business of fixing things quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was certainly didn't do that. I mean, we all wanted him to. We wanted him to come down from the cross and just get everybody that was bad out of here, right? I mean, that's the temptation is to make things quick and happen quickly, but redemption is never quick. And then just to not oversimplify the problem or our ideal response to the problem, and understand that poverty and people are multifaceted issues. Like, there's nothing's going to happen overnight, and that's okay. Because if we're in the business of relationships, then we're in the business of being there long term.
You've given us a lot to think about, Gena, as far as planning and then, can I say, executing short-term missions well. I wonder if you could share with us an example where you've seen it really work well and it's been a blessing.
Yeah, there is one church in particular that I model a lot of this around, and it's a small little church in North Carolina that came down several times while we were living there in Mexico, and they were very intentional about asking our pastor, his name's Pastor David, what his vision was for what they were doing, and what he was already accomplishing without their help. So they talked a lot about that kind of stuff, and then were able to shift their plans and their ideas of what they could do to help, through the lens of what Pastor David needed. And
Mm-hmm.
he was able to express to them certain things. That one thing in particular was finishing the roof of the school that they were building. And I remember sitting down and talking to Pastor David later on about stuff, and said, "What do you think about them?" And one of the things he said is, they asked me a little while ago if I could give them financial information about our church and what we've done since they've come down, and what we're planning to do after they come down this next time. And he
Right.
said, if it was any other church, I wouldn't say it. I would never tell them any of that information. I would say, you don't need to know that. But because of this church and having a good relationship with them, I was happy to share that information with them, because I knew that they were doing it not just to make sure that I was doing my part, but because they really care about us and what we're doing here.
It's interesting. You mentioned there's the principle of relationship there and familiarity. You also mentioned that they came several times to the same place.
Yep.
Another principle that will help build relationship and build familiarity. Sounds like that church did a number of healthy things as they sought to serve well.
Absolutely.
Gena, we want to mention your book again, entitled A Smoldering Wick, Igniting Missions Work with Sustainable Practices. It's available on Amazon if you're interested in looking up that book with those appendices. Gena, if people wanted to follow up with you, if a listener wanted to learn more from you and about justice-based missions, how can they follow you or be in touch with you?
The best way is to go to my website at genathomas.com.
Very good. We'll include that in the show notes as well. And I know that Gena's on different channels of social media as well, so that might be a good way to catch up with her as well. Gena, thanks so much for spending this time with us and adding these stimulating ideas in so that we can think through short-term missions and how we can do it even better in the coming days.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, that's it for today. I hope that you have been informed and even challenged by this episode so that we're thinking carefully about doing short-term missions with excellence. On that note, I'll just quickly mention that in our first season of the podcast, we had several episodes on the topic of short-term missions, including one very relevant here. It was with Don Johnson, episode number 2, Doing Short-Term Missions with Excellence. Don's packed this interview with practical advice for those of us that really want to do short-term missions well. You can find the show notes, of course, on our website, and we invite you to engage with us through Facebook or Twitter as well. We'd love to hear from you. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the entire team, thanks for listening, and we invite you to join us in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.